talk up louder if you like. Do you want a microphone or are we all right? I don't like, being short of stature, I don't like sitting down at the best of times. Thank you all very much for coming today. I've been given the job to chair this session. I think I accepted without fully understanding the ramifications of that. I'd just sort of like to put some context. So we've had a day where we've been looking at outputs, outcomes and objectives of the project. What's been quite interesting for me is in my youth I was an islander, so this sort of development is quite interesting because I grew up on an island with a canal behind me and a river wrapping around the front. And the reality is I was excluded from the rest of my surrounding area. And woe betide if the one bridge out was shut. So for me, I can understand what it's like being part of that community that can get excluded. Apart from it was the other way around, the disadvantaged community was on the island. Social housing, high deprivation within that area, one very small village school. And getting to anywhere, it used to take me an hour and a half to get to my school, for instance. So all sorts of that sort of context, I have a lot of affinity with in terms of the project, and also the affinity of being part of a community that is changing, adapting, and growing. And how do you ensure that the world around you doesn't outpace your life? So today's session is about understanding the opportunities that this development can bring to the area and to the people that already live there, as well as engaging the newcomers. How do we ensure that what they bring, their skills, their assets, to the local community, and how the local community can engage with that? So we've got 4 speakers today. We're going to start with Jonathan, who's new Assistant Chief Executive at Birmingham City Council. We've got to be nice to him because he only started on the 6th of January. And it's your opportunity to listen to him in terms of what opportunities the council sees from a project like this. And then we've got Miles, who comes from the Icknield Port Loop Consortium, who's going to talk about what development opportunities there will be within this area, and what things that might be happening that you may be able to take advantage of. Sarah's going to pick up in terms of one of the work streams around the community researchers, what activities happening there, and the importance of creating those bridges between those large assets and the local communities, and what we're trying to do as a project to enable that to happen. And then lastly, we've got Sam, who's going to give the residents' point of view within all of this. The thing that I would actually like to stress with this project is it's a way of facilitating that engagement. And this project is there to help the community, and we respond to that. So this is an opportunity for you to really engage for the future. Jonathan, you want to?
Yeah, I'll go first. So thank you, Beck and colleagues, I think, for having me here. Yeah, quite right. So 3 weeks in, listening and learning. I've been in the city for 2 years already working in the private sector, so I've got a kind of working understanding, certainly of the city centre and some of the dynamics around different agencies in the place. But I must admit it's exactly this type of project that encouraged me to jump back into the public sector. So it's for conversations like this that I'm back kind of doing what I'm built for, really. And just a minute on that, if you'll kind of indulge me, actually. So I've always worked in places that haven't been dealt a particularly good hand. So that's the kind of history of my career so far. So often associated with the decline of traditional industries in the places where I've worked. So in East Durham it was coal, in Blackburn it was cotton, in Stoke it was clay, and kind of in Birmingham, take your pick, but if you're into kind of alliteration, we'll go with cars. But it could be anything really, couldn't it? And I've always really struggled with this idea that those places are deprived in the language that we as officials try and use. And I've always kind of thought, well, deprived of what? You know, love, passion, culture, hard work. Kind of, these aren't things that have been lacking in those places. So I think I've always been really focused on how do you work with communities to make the most of what they've got and not fixate on what they've lost. And that's very much what's driven me in my career. So as we head into the debate tonight, I'll share 3 quick things with you that I'm thinking about as I start to get up to speed with the city and the way in which the council in particular is perceived and works. So help me understand these tonight, if you may. So one of them is around the role of the council in partnership. And I hear a lot from partners about some good things that we do. And in fact, the leader of the council held quite a big kind of summit in the ICC on Wednesday. And superficially, that felt quite positive. It felt like there was a lot of optimism about the place, and we were kind of moving in the right direction. But you scratch below that surface, and I know that there's some really difficult history in Birmingham around the role of the council. And the sense I get is that it's always been either too dominant or absent, and we've actually struggled to find that balance between. And it's a delicate balance, but it's one that we've clearly got to find. And I think this is a really interesting example, and colleagues have helped me understand this really quickly. And I know, having started out in kind of economic development in the North East, that 10 years ago, this type of project would have been kind of awash with state money and state-sponsored people kind of trying to organise and convene things in a certain way. And clearly that's just not the world that any of us live in anymore. You know, some would argue quite helpfully, actually. So I know that this project has been really successful in drawing down some external funding, but nowhere near the kind of amount that it would have had in the past, and it's trying to use it in a very creative way to build something that's far more sustainable. So, to my mind, coming in really new, this looks like exactly the kind of initiative that could set an exemplar and a case study for how to do this type of thing in a much more mature and sustainable way. So, I know that there'll be some pain for the council in transitioning to that type of approach, but I want to kind of work with you on that and help change what I can back at the base. I think secondly, given my job, I'm keen to hone our approach to strategy in the city and make sure that where we are doing things, they're lined up and we've got our ducks in a row and we're doing things sensibly according to the evidence base and what we've all agreed the priorities are. And again, a quick cursory scan, this sits beautifully for me in line with a number of our big strategic intentions. So whether it's our housing strategy, whether it's our spatial plan, whether it's the kind of noises that the council is making around community development and local leadership, this again kind of sits beautifully for me in a place where it could be a really good example. And particularly looking at the colleagues in the room and Beck and others, maximising the role of academia in what we do in the city. We're kind of blessed with these wonderful institutions, and we need to make the best of them as we go about public policy and not pretend that we kind of operate in a silo. So again, kind of this looks great from that point of view. And finally, I think it's clear to me that Birmingham and the West Mids generally has actually got a massive head start against other parts of the UK on these type of issues. You know, this is by far and away the most energetic, vibrant, diverse, interesting place that I've ever worked. You know, having listed some of those places, and I know that brings its own challenges, and it's complex, and there's a lot of history. But the trick, I think, is, as Beck hinted at actually, is going to be to connect people to some of the growth and change that's going to happen over the next 5-10 years, because the place is going to fundamentally change very quickly. You know, our housing numbers, our population growth, the type of industries that are already coming in to replace those traditional industries that I touched on earlier, it's going to feel quite dizzying over the next 5 or 10 years. And the trick is going to be, for projects like this and for people like us, how do we make sure that it benefits our residents, actually, in addition to those people who are going to come through the door. So again, for Andy Street and the mayoralty, for our political leadership in the city, I think we've got to try and use examples like this to show that inclusive growth, connecting people to some of these opportunities, is actually the real game in town. So from a council point of view, you know, delighted to take part in the start of this conversation. You know, I want to use it as an opportunity to listen. I definitely won't have any answers, but feel free to ask me anything you want later. And my emphasis is about strengthening conversations like this in capacity and communities as we go about doing this and trying to cascade that across the city. So thank you again. I'm delighted to be here. I hope that kind of rings true with what some of you are wanting to achieve from tonight's discussion.
Thank you, John.
I've just got a few slides to run through. I'm Myra Tolkien. I'm actually a consultant to the development partnership that's delivering this project, the Icknield Port Loop project. My brief specifically, I wrote a bit of a manifesto for it, which sets out some ideas about what a new neighbourhood should feel like. It needs to be aspirational, it needs to want to be an exemplar. And then also a sort of placemaking brief, which is about how to not just talk about some of those things that we'd like to see happen, but actually how to make those happen, to put some sort of momentum behind a rhetoric. So I will try and be quick. So excuse me if I just rush a little bit to go through it. I will. There we go. Okay, I put my notes on here, but this was just the extract from the description of this event, despite the great regeneration potential, growing concerns, become an island, etc. And I've just sort of summarised what are we afraid of when we're thinking about the impact that it might have on existing communities. Firstly, that it will be exclusive rather than inclusive, that it will support high values in a small kind of wealthy ghetto, if you like, turn its back to existing neighbourhood. And there are two dangers there. One is that there's a lost opportunity. Maybe it doesn't detract, but actually it just misses an opportunity to contribute to a wider community. And second is it actively consolidates challenges in neighbouring neighbourhoods. There's a sense in which as new developments turn up, quite often they actually, if they are turning their back to existing neighbourhoods, they sort of hem them in, and those neighbourhoods become, you consolidate the problems that already exist in those neighbourhoods. So, and the stock response very often to the idea of encouraging permeability is to do that in physical infrastructure. So anybody who remembers the original master plan for this, there were some additional roads crossing the island over here. That's not always the answer. I think that can just be a right to road. And the example I've given there, which we're familiar with for all the wrong reasons, Kensington and Chelsea has got, cheek by jowl, some of the most deprived and some of the most privileged communities. Now, you can walk anywhere. Those boundaries are not physical boundaries, they're not about bridges and roads, they're socio-political rather than physical. So we have to think permeability in terms of social housing, work accessibility rather than physical connections necessarily. So what are the plans for Port Loop? I've just split this into two. Top down, it should be an exemplary future neighbourhood. Sort of aiming for anything less, I don't think is enough. When you're talking about creating a very sizable new community close to the city and surrounded by existing communities. And this is, I'll write through, this is a sort of manifesto that we wrote which sets out what our ambitions are for the new neighbourhood that's being created. First of all, it's not one neighbourhood, it's several, and around it there are additional neighbourhoods. So there's a little bit of focus on the island, but the island is in fact 50% of the site. But it's the first bit to get developed. And so it's been our focus in terms of delivering this exemplar is to look at what opportunity the island affords to show by example how to create an exemplary neighbourhood. We hope, and then there's other catchments around it, and the idea is each of those will develop with its own kind of logic based on its geography and the character of the land, etc. So our first thought was we would set up our new rules to live by on this within this development. How do people want to live? And these are universal. These are the sort of rules that I think you could apply to any community. Love their neighbourhood, which is about liking your physical environment. It's about quality in the built public realm. It's about architectural interest. It's about opportunities to play, etc. Play out to T is dealing with a bit of a problem that we have uniformly across the UK, which is access to outdoor play for kids, but also for adults. You know, there's an element of that. Plant everything that doesn't move. You can't have too much green, essentially. No more ironing is about service community. Be green without trying is building in, through the design process, sustainability as second nature. So essentially, you're not making choices about whether to be sustainable or not. It's how it happens because that's how it's been designed. Live well by accident, similarly to facilitate healthy living, to make it really easy to make the right kind, the better kind of choice in terms of cycling or walking or being outside, etc. Be a native is about community. Live how you like is about offering lots of different types of housing, lots of different formats. That is important, I think, as well. From when we come on briefly to talk about diversity in a second. Change when you want is about building adaptability, and work where you want is about facilitating those new ways of working, which are becoming more common. 75% of workers in 2025 will be millennials, and 65% of them expect to work from home or from cafes or whatever. So it's sort of facilitating those sort of things. So I won't dwell on these, but I'll just flick through them, and there's some pictures. But in each case, there's something that's making us think that this is something that needs to be addressed. 75% of UK children spend less time outside than prison inmates. We kind of know what barriers are: lack of opportunity, parental fears, digital media. It's about how can you, in the design process, tackle some of those things. So I'll flick through greening everything. This is about service community. Be green without trying. Again, that's a design challenge principally. So all of these things are at least partly about a sort of top-down approach. You can tackle a lot of these issues through design, through putting the time and energy into prioritising them, actually, which is the first step. Be a native, etc. I'll come back to this, etc. So in amongst this, fairly infinite modular housing solutions. There's a few more coming through, which means that you can have lots of different types of houses organised in different ways to facilitate people who might be single occupancy, multi-generational households, you know. And the key to creating a diverse community is to have those opportunities, both in terms of a mixture of housing types, but also a mixture of tenures, so that you have access and availability. Adaptive formats, work where you want, is the kind of creating these formal and informal work opportunities. So, apologies for the spelling mistake. So, I think our approach in looking at this is that diversity is an essential part of a successful neighbourhood. When you look at all the exemplars, where those are and all the places that are very successful, diversity is part of it. They are all inclusive, not exclusive. So, you know, to deliver that, you've got to think beyond the minimum requirements of affordable housing. Clearly, there's a commitment to deliver us 10% affordable housing in this development. But that in and of itself is, you know, a lot of developers would pay lip service to that. They do what was the minimum necessary. You've got to go beyond that. And that means creating access to good quality housing through mixed tenure and mixed housing formats. You know, allow for ownership, shared ownership, renting. There's new tenure models emerging, co-living, multi-generational households are becoming much more common in lots of European countries because of pressures on access to housing, etc. So it's about creating lots of opportunity for people to get involved, not just in activities on the site, but in work or in homes or etc. So then there's the bottom-up bit, which we can deliver from a team of people sat around a table. It's a process rather than a kind of state of being. It's something that's fairly fluid, and it's based on based on people. So individual people will make a difference in their communities by being proactive in a particular way. You don't know who they are necessarily. That's part of the point. So this bit isn't planned. It's about facilitating. It's about creating space in your development to facilitate people doing what people do best, which is things that they're passionate about. And I think that's the gist of that. There's a practical application here. I mean, within the scheme, the first bit to build is a new public park. There will be quite a lot of public uses around this sort of area of the site, where it connects to neighbouring areas. But there's also an intention to retain a block of buildings, which is this, and that's sort of ring-fenced for high-value uses. By high value, I mean uses that contribute a lot to community. not necessarily users that generate a lot of revenue, quite the opposite. So that is about creating the opportunity within the wider development to house or to facilitate uses that might not normally fit in because they're not going to generate income for the developing partners, but they add something to the wider proposition. And that's the cluster of buildings. And what we're in the process of doing now is having conversations with as many people as we can about what might happen in those buildings that might contribute to the wider community, but also will add value to everything else that happens on this site and all the adjoining sites as we go and move through. And it's worth bearing in mind the development process will go on for 10 years or more, and in that time lots of things can happen. So it's also about trying to create space to provide for what changes that might occur. So in the first phase there'll be some very simple things, interventions, low cost, that just take quite hard urban spaces and make them into community spaces. This is just an example of a scheme in Belgium. That's the High Line, which also you'll be familiar with. So those are the sort of ideas that we're looking at for some of the hardscape and the ramp in that area. But what we'll be doing is finding local partners to work with on those. We've spoken to Jane, who did the East Side projects. We've spoken to use it, of course. The first house on the development might be a hen house, we don't know, but there's that sort of idea. PS1 did a great garden, which is a productive garden. So that's in New York, it's the spin-off of Museum of Modern Art. So those sorts of ideas, there will be a community garden as part of that process, and it's really a question of finding who we're going to work with. The development partners won't deliver any of this. It will be about identifying the right partners to work with who will deliver it and creating the conditions for them to do it. That's really what the place-making agenda is mostly about. There's the canal, obviously, conversations with CRT. They've got a couple of holes there, which are empty boat holes. The idea is to make some floating forests. That's actually an outlet that was in Birmingham a few years back. Here's another version. We're quite keen on that. So these are the sorts of things that we'd work with CRT and other partners on. The Canals and Rivers Trust, by the way, if anyone's not familiar with who that is. We've got warehouse space. We could host, this is a film club. We've potentially got workshop space. We've potentially got, activities like pottery, whatever, those sorts of uses. We've got a bit of space there. The idea is that these kind of uses fit into those buildings. This is a scheme in Liverpool where an architect just out of college has designed this great canopy space. Nice to create some opportunities for some interesting design as well, but for recent graduates, etc. So these are all the sorts of uses that might go into those buildings. Fabrican is an art design centre in Copenhagen. Studio space, installational, with art installations we're working with at the moment East Side Project and also Icon, discussing various ideas that might be brought forward for that. Art car boot sale, they've not been out of London yet, but they've expressed an interest in coming in and doing a regular event here. Some more homegrown, Digbeth Dining Club, possibly vintage. So there's a sort of events programme as well, because it's quite a good resource there. And tying into events like the 250th anniversary of the circus, which is the Hippodrome event, etc. Tying up with people like Flatpack, tying up with people like East Side Projects who are proposing. We've said to them that we'll give them a site to build their house on. They've got a project for designing and building artist houses that are an artist house in perpetuity. So that's a way of sort of trying to engage. So that's sort of that's our quick rattle through. We're in that process right now of having conversations so we can find those partners who might help to deliver the stuff. And as I say, the partnership's role is to make it possible by creating clean, dry shells that people can use either for nothing or for very low rents, etc. Those sort of things. Okay?
Sarah? Hello, I'm Sarah Hassan. I'm a research fellow at the University of Birmingham. And I'm currently working on the community research program as part of Use It. And Use It, as we know, is about unlocking social and economic innovation together. And I see this part of Use It as being the innovative part. So, like Miles explained, all the development, the big development project that's happening, with all its approaches, Use It provides an opportunity for the community to engage. And the community research program is about empowering the community to give them the opportunity for a bottom-up approach in this development. So, as we know, we are currently trying to find out people in the community who have interest in their neighborhoods, who can provide insights about the aspirations of their community and how we can make use of such large infrastructure projects that are happening now. This is a golden opportunity. The timing is perfect for the communities to have a say, to have a voice. The community research program has been running for 8 months now. We've got very enthusiastic people looking for more enthusiastic people who can further develop ideas that can be quite useful for the partners, Birmingham City Council and of course Urban Staff and all the other partners. So, as Jonathan said, we're not looking at the area as an area of deprivation, because it's not. It's an area of an urban transformation, a very rich area, an area of opportunity. And if we do look at it from this perspective, then that changes the landscape. Changes the landscape for the development that's being built, to look at all the different communities that are within the area. We have an influx of communities who've been local to the area for many years, as well as an influx of migrants, as well as a very rich dynamic happening within the area. And it is very important to capitalize on this dynamic that is happening in order to get them engaged, a very well synchronized community working together. And this is the main aim of the community research program for Use It. Use It is a number of work packages, very, very powerful work packages, building on the capacities in the community. We have a skills matching work package that's trying to mine for different skills within the community. We have a social enterprise work package trying to as well mine for ideas for social enterprises. And the community research program is looking to investigate all of these opportunities so that we can build on it in the development. And I'm happy to hear today the different ideas that we can get out, and different questions that we might be able to discuss together on the community research program.
Thank you, Sam. Sam?
Thank you. My name is Sam Ewell, and you can tell from my accent that even though I live in this patch in Ladywood, that I'm not from here. Like a lot of people that live on my street, I speak English with an accent. And my neighbors often remind me, they say, Sam, you speak American as a first language and English as a second language. Just remember that. And but that's part of the beauty of the place where we live, is the diversity. Miles, you mentioned that as one of the things that you want to celebrate, and with the new people that will move in. So I wear two hats today. I'm a resident, and I'm also a community connector. So full disclosure, my instincts, my background as a community organizer, I tend to work at the neighborhood level, at the relational level, at the level that we can come together and make things happen pretty quickly. And when I first heard about Use It, my filters went up, and I really went, can anything really good come out of Use It? That was my kind of initial gut reaction. And I think it's really interesting because during the day we've heard about this analogy or the metaphor of top-down, bridging top-down with bottom-up. Miles, you alluded to that as well. And I do think that Use It at its best can do that. It can be that bridge. But what I wanted to share was actually to shift the metaphor, to introduce a different metaphor, to talk about that, to talk about one example of where I think Use It is a win, where it's working at that neighborhood level and connecting up things that neighbors can't do on their own, and then to think about a bit of a proposal around how Use It, how Port Loop and neighbors can work together, these three stakeholders that are represented here. The metaphor I wanted to introduce is actually, it's from biology. My first degree was biology. And it's actually a biological principle. It's not just an idea, but a principle. And it's called the edge effect. Anyone heard of the edge effect? Okay, very briefly. Edge effect, when you have, in biology, you have two ecosystems. So imagine a forest and a field, two different ecosystems. Where they meet, that's the edge. The edge effect in biology, you always have the most biodiversity, at the most species, the most life happening at the edge. That's the edge effect. Where we live, there's a lot of edge. Now, both biologically, but when you're talking about human ecosystems or human ecology, there's edge. Different languages can present an edge. Different cultural patterns, the employed, unemployed, there's a lot of edge. The thing about human ecology is, whereas in biology, that pattern is that it tends towards greater diversity and benefit, in human ecology, that diversity has to be tended. That's the point. It has to be cultivated. Someone's got to be there tending that edge. And that's why I want to propose that Use It at its best. It could be enhancing that edge effect. So I gave you the biological example. The biggest edge that I see in place is the edge between what I would call associational life. So that's the life of neighborhoods, people coming together by consent, just because they can and they get together. But the edge that Use It is trying to bridge that associational life with is with what could be called institutional life. So that's the life of the council. And also stakeholders like planners or Canal and River Trust, who were here earlier today, where residents by themselves don't actually have the agency to make those decisions, but they're shaped by them. So that edge between associational life and institutional life is where I think Use It has the potential to really cultivate something that's diverse, that's permeable, and that's really beneficial. An example of where I see that happening, again, this is embryonic, but it has gotten me over my prejudices about what can happen from the top. So I live in this area, and you've heard the reservoir mentioned. There's a field here, and I walk by that field twice a day. I walk my dog there. There's a group of dog walkers, associational life, lots of people, massive footfall around this reservoir. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, we should have a dog park. Oh, wouldn't it be great to have a cafe container? And 2,000 people walk here a day, and there's no place to go to the loo. Imagine a family walking their kids or having a stroll. It starts to rain. There isn't any, that infrastructure's not there. And residents by themselves, by fiat, are not just going to say, put the loo here and put the cafe there. But that energy is there to do something in that space. And the people who own that space, the Birmingham settlement, have actually, through Use It, there's been a conversation that's been established to dream together about what can happen in that space. So that edge between lots of diverse people happening, associational life, wanting to gather, wanting to do something, maybe even wanting to have a community business there, is unlocked because who to even have the conversation with is now known and it's been enabled. So that's the example of, I think, a win, what Use It, what I want to see more of. The other thing that I would just say about that example is as a resident, and the framework that I come with, it's an asset-based approach. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but unlike a needs approach, which only sees problems, only sees lacks or deficits, the asset-based approach asks, how do we respond to what's wrong by starting with what's strong, what's in our hands, what we can do? And interestingly, studies have shown 60% of what local communities need to thrive is at hand. It's a primary asset. It's the gifts, it's the talents, things that they can just bring together. 20% needs to be unlocked. That would be like this field that I just mentioned. You don't have direct access to it. It needs to be unlocked. And only the other 20 is a service or good that the community isn't going to produce. That might be health, that might be education or something else. 80% people is there. It just needs to be joined up. And so what I'm excited about is how Use It is helping the 60 become detected and the 20 become unlocked. And that's just one example. So to conclude, I would just have a bit of feedback, going back to my metaphor of the edge effect, around for Use It and those that are partners in Use It. I think the edge inside Use It as a project is how do you take something that is big as Use It and the language of KPIs and USPs, that language, a formal project language, how do you translate that and talk to people at the neighborhood level? So, key performance indicators, that's a language of one ecosystem of institutions. And I'm not junking that. I'm just saying when you go to a neighborhood and talk, you're not going to talk about KPIs. You're going to be talking about what are you passionate about? What's your thing? What do you want to see happen at the reservoir? If you had 3 other people to do something with, what would you do? And so it's that translation work that I think is the edge for Use It. Miles, I love your storyline around the manifesto, and I had the privilege of hearing it earlier, and hearing it the second time, what encourages me is that you're aware of this diversity and permeability. Because the island metaphor, this is why I introduced the edge effect, the island metaphor for me, by itself, without any commentary, it does sound ghetto as a resident, because I happen to live close to where this island will be populated. And so I was encouraged to you, and I love the way you're creating these 10 commandments, this vision. One of the things that I hear people say, my neighbors say all the time, is we want to be able to live where we live, not just sleep where we live. We want to be able to work where we live, to eat, to play, and that's the vision you're casting. And the edge there is that there are already people there. So when you cast that vision, people, how are they becoming aware of the other gifts and communities and the diversity, and to see that not as a threat but as an asset to those people who move there. And to my resident friends in the room, I would, just using myself as an example, I said, full disclosure, I had serious concerns about Use It when I first heard about it. And I didn't drink the Kool-Aid. What I'm saying is a lot can happen out of it that I didn't see how it was going to happen before I actually began to spend time around the people who were working on it. And this edge of the institutions and associations, it's a creative edge. It can be and should be a creative edge. And so I would say to my resident friends who are here, this event today was described as yes in my backyard. Well, I think we all know that whether we said no or yes, it's going to happen. So the challenge to us who actually live in this patch is how do we move beyond seeing it either as a threat or as the white savior on a horse coming in saying, this is the answer to all our problems, but see it as an edge, as a creative possibility, and ask ourselves what kind of backyard do we want to live in, and to get busy with that.
Thank you, Sam. The next bit is more of it's your opportunity to ask questions on the panel. And I thought actually I'd pick up with Sam's challenge really to the other members of the panel in terms of there is a key issue around wanting to be able to live where we live. So how do we maintain that? And also how do we ensure that that this project and this work does stay at that edge, because very quickly you can get subsumed into deliverables and monitoring, etc. Actually, how do we keep it innovative? Who would like to start answering Sam's challenge, really? Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting to hear Sam use the word ecosystem, because that was exactly the kind of parallel I was going to draw with this, because I think, particularly thinking about how this might be cascaded across the city as a model, I think the risk actually is that we try and almost see these as products that are able to be replicated, and we come up with some kind of horrendous governance structure that tries to kind of almost sell this on in other places. And I think, as I touched on earlier, the leader of the council had this debate around partnership working generally in the city on Wednesday. And my big overriding conclusion coming out of that was that everything at a community and neighbourhood level shouldn't be almost codified as a structure which the council tries to govern. And yes, we're going to have ward members after May who are going to come back and be elected in every place, but we shouldn't try and over-govern what happens at that level. So I think it's very much about how we work with our partners in all agencies, not least the kind of developer community, to create the conditions for a patchwork approach across the city. And there'll be some places that need more support, and I think we almost need a kind of minimum offer from the council as to what kind of support we would give in those places. And we've got a bit of a window between now and June, basically, to start talking to all politicians and different parties about what that offer might be. But I think I'm absolutely comfortable and would support that notion of the city being a patchwork, and that we celebrate what's unique and different in different places, and make sure that our kind of gut response isn't a horrendous bureaucratic gut response, and that it's actually a very enabling, supportive response that just tries to support and run with whatever's happening in that place. Because as Miles said, it's often down to key individuals and people who are prepared to put themselves forward, and everyone's interested in different things. So it would be entirely futile, I think, to kind of try and overmanage this. And it was interesting to hear kind of Sarah's contribution about there's almost just enough structure around things like skills matching, and you can see there's a degree of kind of project in this just to get it moving and get it organised, but there's not too much that it appears stifled or kind of overly consistent. So I'm absolutely in line with that. Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Miles?
Yeah, I think the metaphor of the edge is interesting, and in a sense, I think in the way that we've thought about that group of buildings is exactly that sort of proposition, if you like, that a certain amount of that activity will be related to new uses that come in, but a big proportion of that will be related to wider community. But wider community, I think for that, isn't necessarily just a geographical thing. Actually, it might be a wider community that's citywide as well as within the greater Icknield area, or etc. So community exists on lots of different levels, simultaneously. And the only issue I'd take with the idea of the edge metaphor is that if, in taking forward the scheme that's being developed and delivered over the next 10 years across the island and then the surrounding areas, it should be permeable enough in terms of access to quality housing, for instance, or opportunities to work or jobs, that actually it's not an old community and a new community. In that process, there should be a lot more permeability, so that it becomes a community. So the only issue I take with the edge scenario is that there's these two distinct ecosystems, and I think that new development, new neighbourhoods should take steps to avoid that being a kind of end, a destination, put it that way. So that is about being creative about delivering different types of housing, for instance, just on the housing front, very different types of housing, different scales and different types of tenure. So if you're living locally and you really fancy something that's coming up on the island, that's a good choice for you and a choice that you can make. I think that's the sort of other way to, I mean, we've created a rod for our own back by talking about the island. The island was a device to sort of set up, talk about rule change. We can create, if it's an island when you cross a body of water, the rules change. In literature and islands about, setting your own rules, and really the rules that we were talking about trying to come up with were the rules that would apply to every neighbourhood. You know, there isn't, I'd like to think there's nothing in there that would be exclusive and that wouldn't equally apply to every other neighbourhood. It's really just a way of device for coming up with ideas about what a neighbourhood should be, I think. So, I'm not sure that was an answer to the question or not.
Sarah, what role can the community researchers play in maintaining the edge, or that blurred edge?
Yeah, well, maintaining the edge, but keeping the integration between the old and the new community happening. I think it's very beneficial for the new community to be able to tap on the different assets that the local area already has. And what we've been working in our community research program on mapping these assets and trying to identify them in order to have a base that the old community can use and a base that the new community can tap into. So I imagine that people who are moving into the IPL development, like Peter always says, can go down Cape Hill to buy at the local African shop some exotic black soap. We need this integration to happen. We want this integration to be encouraged. We don't want the focus to be just on the island, but to encourage these different assets and map them out. And the community research program is about that. It's about trying to identify what assets the community sees. What do you value as residents, as local residents?
Thank you. I'll take questions from the floor. I'll take 3 questions and then pose them to the panel. If you could say who you are and what interest you have in the project. The lady at the back.
My name's Anne Gallagher. I don't know if there's that many people who actually are local residents. I have to run the Gentrification project, I run the Place of Welcome, I have to run the Time Bank. I live locally, I've lived locally for about 37 years. What concerns me slightly is, I love academic things and intellectual things. However, what concerns me is practical stuff, what's actually going on. I went to look at the, when they show us what sort of housing we built. I'd like to downsize, but there's no way I can afford to move on to that development, which is quite disappointing because as someone is getting older, if you want to move out your house and release some equity and have a good time. So it concerns me because around here we're seeing quite a lot of private development, studio flats, and gated communities, and I don't think that's actually that beneficial. This is a brilliant area to live in, but it's had to be addressed for a long time. And what concerns me, there's a lot of talk, we've been talking about this for about 25 years, so I'm waiting for my great-grandchildren to come for it to materialise. I want to ask a really practical question. Somebody said that the swimming pool, the work on the swimming pool would start last October, and I'm not seeing anything. And it would be really nice after 20 odd years to have a swimming pool locally. And I'm just sort of a bit confused about, there's loads of talk, there's loads of people getting paid to swan in and swan out, who maybe don't work in the evening, don't work at the weekend. And some things about this area are brilliant, but a lot of things do need developing, and we don't necessarily have the human capital. A lot of people in this area are working their socks off to survive, and others can't get work. And one of the things we're really concerned about is how do we enable those people to volunteer and then to move into work if possible. But I remember asking Urban Splash quite a while ago. They said some of the buildings are going to stay up, and anyone who's interested in social enterprises could access them. One of the things, cooperative council sounds great, and we've got lots of support from the council and working well with them through the Jump Food project. But I also think it's a really challenging way of working for people who are employed. For many people who are employed, they really struggle with community, because community is messy and cheeky and arrogant and resourceful, in my opinion. But they're hard to work with because we spend our time going, I've turned into one of the old women, which I was determined never to be. But, I am concerned because there's a lot of talk. And we've been here before with SRB6, City Challenge, Aston Pride, and, we want to see that there's some lasting results. So I'd be really interested to know, when is that swimming pool, when is the ground being broken? Because we were told October. And obviously with all the problems around Carillion, it's very concerning. You know, will the people who are doing Icknield Port Loop be the next to go? So I don't have to question.
Can I break that up into a 3 questions? I'll try anyway.
What's really going to happen on the ground with the people who are here already?
I think what I captured from that, if you let me play back, is one of the themes around the project is assets, and you make a good case in terms of the swimming pool. That's an asset that hasn't been developed. What's going to happen with things like that and into the future? There's also opportunities, so we've got opportunities in different work streams, so social enterprise, etc. But actually, what does that mean for creating employment opportunities at the local level? And then unfortunately, there's a general one around BCC's approach and how does it adapt the way it does things to enable communities to be dealt with. Jonathan?
Can I add another one?
Yeah.
So I heard something in there around affordability actually, and access to these properties, and I think that's a really fair challenge actually. And having worked with Urban Splash in other parts of the country, you know, I know that this is quite an innovative model for the UK generally, and it's a bit of a toe in the water as to whether there is the market actually to respond. Now in principle, it sounds like it's sensible, doesn't it, that it's flexible, it's modular, you can change over a lifetime, but other market factors like access to credit and where people are at in terms of their own ability to access that market, I think it's a fair challenge. And I think I'm looking to Jacob at the back. The council has got a role to play from a planning perspective in that, to try and manage and get the balance right as to how local residents can access these things around affordability. So if I kind of look to Jacob for a view on that and the swimming pool, that would help me out of the hole.
First of all, yes, completely. 16's approach, you have policy in place, it's 35%. Whether that can be achieved or the question mark is, there's always a balance between having houses built and having no houses built. But one thing we are keen to do, working with Urban Splash and with other developers in the area, it's not just about Icknield Port Loop, but actually it's also City Hospital, it's Soho Loop, it's sites in Smedic. There's a lot of wider area here of change that's happening. It's about probably 5,000–6,000 houses over the whole wider area. It's about looking at what the local market needs. So it's not just one version of affordable housing, it's not one model, so it might be for ownership, it might be shared rent, it might be social or market. There's a whole mixture of models that we're looking at, and I can't say, Anne, that the answer is this. It's something that we as a planning authority are working very closely with developers and all those sites to make sure we can maximise that community benefit. On the swimming pool, I'm going to put my neck on the line here and say it'll be on site at some point this year and hopefully sooner rather than later. I'd like to be able to go a little bit further than that, but I had an email yesterday, which means I've got to go to a meeting about it tomorrow to sort out the land transfer, but I am very, very confident we'll be on site hopefully in a matter of weeks. Certainly this half of the year, we should have it opening 12 to 18 months time, all very well. It's been a long time coming. The swimming pool's been talked about for at least 25 years and Golden was not down. We're finally there, and that's one of the benefits of these sorts of schemes, is that swimming pool has been partly funded by the Icknield Port Loop scheme. It's worth noting the City Council are joint out landowner, and so actually some of the money's coming out of that development to pay for that new swimming pool, and that's something, you know, there's a £2 million receipt plus the land. And as I say, we're having a debate about how much we need to pay for the last little bit of extra land to have a bigger, better pool than we've been proposed. But as I say, I'm hopeful for positive announcements in the very near future on that. And I'll be pleased with this stuff because it's been a long journey, I'll be honest with you all. But it's on its way, definitely, finally. And, yeah.
Next question. My name is Icknield. I'm a resident. I bought my house about 22 years ago, just south of the centre of the Malcolm Wall there. I work as an artist. I've worked in this community as a paramedic for 17 years and also a property developer there in this property. I've rode on the reservoir and all my dog there as well, so I haven't actually seen Sam. But, so I welcome this development. I'm an associate member of ESP. I think that's great about the artist's house. Also, you know, everybody side those initiatives, and I've seen Urban Splash is working on this. As for swimming, I'd actually rather be swimming in the reservoir itself. But that would be great, yeah. So my concern though is how the methodology is used for the engagement within the community and bringing people on board. Because to be perfectly honest, despite my connections as an artist and residency in Birmingham, I haven't actually seen that much about opportunities to get involved as either an artist or actually as a resident. So where are we going? How are you getting people on board?
Yeah. Okay, so obviously Urban Splash and Places for People, which is the social landlord, the partnership with Birmingham refers houses is relatively new to this situation, as you know, because it's been gone through a number of phases, and I've got involved relatively recently. The first thing that we've tried to do is write the manifesto. We'll launch that in about 6 to 8 weeks, and that will be an open invitation to everybody to come along, and essentially an invitation to engage in whatever way people think that they can contribute something, or that we can contribute something to what they're doing. And the aim of the next sort of 12 months is to put some momentum behind the words, essentially. I think there is a lot of words are often spoken about new development, and quite often things don't happen. Returning to the first question, no, the intention here is that there will be real momentum and there will be movement. The first part of the scheme delivered, as I mentioned, is a public park close to Icknield Port Road, and that is on site shortly and will be completed this year. So things will happen. In terms of the things like social enterprise, for instance, those kinds of uses, any uses that might happen in that kind of new cultural hub or community neighbourhood sort of hub that we've talked about, we want to be finding out over the course of the next 6 months who we're going to work with, in what way, knowing that the partnership won't deliver any of it. Essentially, it will just be about facilitating other people to do what, to facilitate people to do what works, or what works for them and what works for a wider community. So there's an intention there. I'd like to think that you'll find that it will become a reality.
Sarah, do you want to pick up on the community researchers?
Yeah, on the community researchers, so when we began to develop the community research program, we set out on an empty spreadsheet to try and identify the different communities first that we are going to be working with, and from them to try and identify the different themes that appeal to the communities and are of interest to the communities. And at this stage, we have identified a number of emerging themes, including arts and culture, which is a very big theme for Use It. And what we are working on now is developing a tailored program for each of these themes to target the different areas according to the communities we previously identified. So we will be having more flyers and more advertising for the program as soon as we have dates. We have upcoming dates. We haven't advertised for that yet, but they are in February 15th and 16th of February, and you will see more publication and advertising for these trainings. We're also trying to encourage people to go on the Facebook page and on the Twitter page, where we have daily inputs of our activities in the different work packages.
Can I just add to that as well, to be made clear? There's an ongoing project called Waterworks Artists Residents being run from Elsfollow. So again, for local people, that's an ongoing project running from mid-October through to mid-May this year. City Council part's funding up our art budget from memory, so it's just if you are interested. It's a really future, it's Lizzie Jordan and people like that, so if you are really interested, that's the one is there going on at the moment. So just to say that if people aren't familiar with that, there's an opportunity to get involved like there. It's a separate project to use, if there's something else that's going on, it's very much a part of the city.
I'm Summerfield Residents Association and Friends of Edgbaston Reservoir. Miles, when you were talking about your future vision for the new development, I have to tell you all that is going on in the Summerfield area. We have a great gardening scheme over at the hospital, which is quite instructive for anybody who's interested in composting and all the benefits that flow from that. And Sam's had a great input there with his worms as well. And we're also a very diverse area, and thanks to Anne, we have lots of social events going on in the neighbourhood, and we have got an artist community here and a musicians community, and it all needs to be brought together. I also have to say, apropos the City Council, I've been chairing a Friends of Edgbaston Reservoir now for about 30 years. We came into existence because we wanted to put power boats on the reservoir, and by our lobbying we managed to get that finished. It is now a special nature reserve, and it's got all sorts of wonderful things happening at the reservoir. I want to say to Sam that Harry S. Truman said that it's amazing how much you can get done as long as you don't take the credit for it. But I'd hate to see take the credit for say, the use of Birmingham settlement land, because that's been an ongoing sore for at least 20 years, when the council were offered that land at a very low rate, and it stopped on somebody's desk because there was no joined-up thinking in the council. And so, if you can get the council to do some joined-up thinking, I know this is one separate area, but there's so many agencies involved around here, then that would be a great asset. For instance, there is an area behind the council house, it's called the long grass, and it's amazing what you'll find in that long grass. And one of them would be, of course, the fact that we've got 2 grow sites in the area, which were put there by the council, council money and council resources. They're now falling into disrepair. But if you want to ask anybody in the council about them, there's nobody there to ask. So there's all sorts of people who are responsible, but they have to pass it on to somebody higher up, and it gets lost in the system. So it would be good, again, if people here in the neighbourhood knew who exactly to contact in the council to get things done. But so what I'm saying is there shouldn't be a wall between us and the new development, and the new development again has helped the reservoir, because they're now drawing up a plan for the reservoir where the settlement field is on the agenda, and people from the settlement are there in the room when we're discussing all the issues around the reservoir, so that we can get a unified plan. Unfortunately, 2 of the planners who are responsible for that plan have since left the council, so that's not the council's fault, but again it shows that we're dealing with a big entity, and for us as a grouping, it's having that solid relationship with the council so that we can have two-way traffic. So the points are, we've got it all going on, let's try and spread it into the new community, and I think you have to talk to the people on the ground who are doing it, have been doing it for a long time. Don't just come in and try and say, oh, this is a good idea if we tried this, when it has been tried, or it is being tried, and there should be a two-way dialogue, not a up-down dialogue, as I think is still going on at the moment.
Thank you. Your challenge back to use it about what real impacts are was actually the focus of this afternoon, and that was my challenge back to the project itself in terms of what would have happened whether you'd existed or not. And it's very important in terms of evaluation and monitoring to be able to demonstrate what is real impact. And a lot of that discussion actually focused on the strategic added value of bringing people together to discuss things. So it's very pertinent for today, your comment. I'm going to have to field it back to the panel in terms of the joined up thinking though, and how do we deal with the long grass?
I suspect that's very accurate analysis. But I also suspect that my kind of colleagues in the council would have a series of different professional perspectives on that issue. I'm quite fortunate in the sense that I don't come from one of those professional perspectives, so I'm often able to kind of glide across the top and ask the benign questions that just seem to kind of come back to common sense on some of these things, and that's certainly what I will do on this. I think on your point about where do you go to kind of raise these things and get some traction, I think your first port of call should be an elected member locally, and as I say, I think we're looking at a model of, so what kind of support do we put around elected members, particularly after May, when we're going to have this 4-year cycle without politics every year, which is quite exciting, I think, for Birmingham to think differently about how it resolves some of these issues over time. So, you know, all I can do is commit to take that away and provide some internal challenge, really. And I think that similarly, colleagues in the council around elected members need to have exactly that kind of can-do attitude. And as I said at the top of my piece, I think sometimes it's really simple, isn't it? It's about a gut response to saying, this is a good thing, this is something we should celebrate, let's try and solve some of these practical and professional dilemmas that we seem to tie ourselves up in and find a way to push through this. So you've certainly got a kind of ally here in trying to tackle some of that. And yeah, there'll be a myriad of those kind of issues across the city because there's clearly a lot of history in the place. But, you know, I'm certainly optimistic. I think we've got this interesting window now to do things slightly differently, which is why I'm here to help support members to do just that. Okay.
I've singly failed to keep us on track and on time, so I'll take one more question if that's okay, and then let you all go on.
Yeah, Leslie Bolton, still proud to work for the City Council despite everything, and also part of the Use It programme with a special responsibility for the Ladywood area. It's more an observation than anything else. The vision that's been set out for this new development is fabulous. Who wouldn't want to live there? We all would. How can we, in the current climate, with the limited resources we've got, get that same time, energy, passion, attention and creativity turned 90 degrees to those tower blocks in Ladywood and my crappy rundown community centre that's got peeling paint? How do we achieve that same level of energy and commitment into something that isn't a new build with private money? Because that's where our focus needs to be at the same time. It should not be on the new and shiny.
Yes, I can have a go at that. It's interesting, I was involved in a proposal that was put forward in Milton Keynes recently for a new neighbourhood there. And in the process of doing that, I went back to the original plan for Milton Keynes, and it reminded me of the extent to which actually the government and local authorities felt it was their duty and obligation to provide good quality housing for people. And that's been essentially, I think, passed over to the private sector in many decades since. The answer, I think, so that's really that's an observation back, but actually I think the government and local authorities should have more of a role to play in encouraging new models of new neighbourhoods. But I would say the private sector can also do, you mentioned the tower block that's adjacent. Sorry?
There's several.
Several. And actually those are the kinds of projects that Urban Splash as a development company essentially cut their teeth on. And this is situations where, for instance, in Manchester, in an area called Collyhurst, 3 towers, largely decanted, were passed over from the City Council to Urban Splash to redevelop those blocks. And that's essentially what happened, and the tenure in those blocks is very mixed. It's a tenure blind solution, so there's a bit of shared ownership, there's some direct ownership, there's students in there, there's working people, etc. And those sorts of schemes have been successful. So I do think the private can contribute to that, but as in the case of 3 towers, the local authority, the city or the government have to play a part in doing that. And what happened there to make it happen was that the city gave the blocks to Urban Splash for £1, so that Urban Splash could afford to redevelop those blocks and bring them up to a standard that made them desirable and actually change people's perception of an area of the city that was a no-go area previously. So I think there are other ways of that's all I'm saying, and I don't think that this is in a way, yes, there's a lot of new build that will go into this, but the approach that Splashes of Power brings to this is similar in a way to the role that they played in turning around lots of actually surplus social housing projects in Leeds, in Sheffield with Park Hill and Saxton. So there's a commonality of purpose, which is to create community around these places. So it's great that that I'd fully expect that there's lots of exciting things happening in the return to the previous question as well. There's lots of exciting things happening, and it is absolutely a two-way thing, because from the point of view of someone coming into an area, they want to know what the wider proposition is. They want to know that there's access to the reservoir, and the reservoir is the best version of the reservoir that it can be. And I think that's very much part of the story that a developer coming in on Quarry, for instance, wants to know that there's a wider proposition. And it's about, again, turning to the point, it's about just doing something to facilitate that in whatever way you can.
Jonathan, did you want to?
I think it's well covered. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. I'm afraid you're a little bit late, but we did start a bit later. And if you do have any further questions, please post them on the Facebook page, and the team will deal with them as and when. I'd like to thank the panel themselves. Thank you all.